I had always thought of myself as someone who lived a simple life. But the letter that arrived that morning changed everything. It came in a plain, brown envelope with a seal I didn't recognize. At first, I thought it was junk mail or perhaps some promotional offer. But then I saw the name at the top, my late uncle's name. A name that stirred both fond memories and a deep sense of loss. I hadn't spoken to him in years. To be honest, I had nearly forgotten about him, except for the occasional visit to his old farm when I was a child. It wasn't long before I tore open the envelope, not fully understanding what it contained. I scanned the letter quickly. The words on the page seemed to blur together at first, but then they hit me like a punch to the gut. My uncle had left me a piece of property, a piece of land in a small town I had never heard of. A place I didn't even know existed. The letter was formal, filled with legal jargon, but it was clear, this was mine now. I had no idea what to make of it. My uncle had never mentioned it. I never knew he had any land, let alone a place of such significance. As I stared at the words on the paper, my mind raced. What was this land? What had my uncle kept hidden all these years? I decided to drive there that very day. As I made my way through the winding roads, memories of my childhood with my uncle came flooding back. I remembered running through fields, picking wildflowers, and sitting with him on the porch, listening to his stories of the land. It wasn't just land, it was his life. His legacy. A place where every tree and rock held a story, a memory of who he was. When I finally arrived at the property, my heart sank. The land, which had always been open and peaceful, was now filled with construction equipment. Developers were digging into the earth. I stepped out of my car, my mind racing. What's going on here? I asked one of the workers. He turned, barely acknowledging me. This land's no longer viable for personal use. We're developing it. You'll need to sign over the rights soon. It's just the way things go. My stomach twisted. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. This was my inheritance, my family's land, and they were already treating it like a commodity to be sold. I couldn't let this happen. Not without a fight. I stood there, feeling the weight of the situation pressing down on me. The man in front of me, Mr. Collins, was dressed in a crisp suit, the kind that said, "I'm here to take what's mine, and you're in my way." He looked at me as though I was just another obstacle in his path. I stepped forward, trying to keep my voice steady, but I couldn't hide the frustration that bubbled up inside me. Who authorized this development? This land is mine. I demanded. Mr. Collins barely glanced at me before handing me a thick stack of papers. "Here," he said, his voice dismissive. "These documents confirm that the land is no longer under your ownership. It's been legally transferred. You need to sign the release form." I took the papers from him, feeling my heart race as I scanned through the pages. Legal jargon. Terms I didn't understand. Words that made my stomach twist in knots. My eyes blurred as I tried to make sense of it all. It was as though the more I read, the more it felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The land, my family's legacy, was slipping through my fingers. "I didn't sign any of this," I said, my voice shaking now. "This isn't right." Collins shrugged, unfazed. "That's not my problem," he said. "You're just delaying the inevitable. This is about progress, and you're holding it up." I clenched my jaw, fighting the overwhelming panic rising in my chest. I couldn't let this happen. Not to my uncle's land. But what could I do? I wasn't a lawyer. I didn't know the first thing about property law. "Listen," Collins continued, glancing at his watch. "You have until the end of the week to make things easier on yourself. Sign the papers, and you'll get a decent settlement for your troubles." I wanted to yell at him, to throw the papers back in his face, but I knew I had to stay calm. I wasn't going to let him bully me. But as I stood there, a sick feeling crept up my spine. It felt like I was standing on the edge of something far worse than just losing land. It felt like I was standing at the edge of a fight I wasn't prepared for. That night, after everyone else had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the stack of papers in front of me. The words blurred together, but something caught my eye. A name. A signature. I flipped through the papers again, my hands trembling. And there it was, buried deep in the deed, my uncle's signature. But it was wrong. The handwriting didn't match. It wasn't his. I stared at the signature for what felt like an eternity, and then it hit me like a freight train. This wasn't just a mistake. It was fraud. I didn't know what to do next, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going down without a fight. The knot in my stomach hadn't loosened since that day with Mr. Collins. If anything, it had only tightened. But I couldn't just sit there, waiting for someone to take what was rightfully mine. I needed answers, and I needed them fast. I called Tom, a local lawyer who I'd known from years ago. We didn't exactly keep in touch, but I remembered him as a straight shooter. After explaining the situation, he was hesitant, almost too hesitant, like he was already sensing that this wasn't going to be an easy case. "You're sure about this?" he asked, his voice cautious. "I mean, this land, if it's already been transferred legally." "It hasn't," I interrupted, trying to steady my voice. "The signature on the deed is forged." "I know it. I've seen my uncle's handwriting before. This is a scam." He sighed, clearly skeptical but agreeing to help. "All right, I'll look into it. But you need to prepare yourself. Sometimes, these things, they don't just go away." I didn't care what it took. I needed the truth. A few days later, Tom called me back. His voice was sharp, filled with the weight of what he had uncovered. "You were right," he said. "This land has been part of multiple illegal transactions over the past few years. There's more here than just a forged signature." My heart sank. "What do you mean?" "Fake property surveys," he explained. "The land was transferred from your uncle's name to another party using forged documents, but that's not all. There are falsified signatures all the way through the chain of ownership. Your uncle's signature, whoever signed it, wasn't the only one tampered with." I stared at the phone, feeling like the floor had just dropped out from under me. My family's land, the one my uncle had passed down to me, had been systematically stolen. The legal system had been manipulated, and I had no idea how deep this went. "Is there any way to fight this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure yet," Tom admitted. "But we're going to dig deeper. I've already contacted a few colleagues who specialize in land fraud. We'll need to file a motion to halt the current development, at least temporarily." But that's just the beginning. I couldn't process everything he was saying. It felt like a whirlwind of emotions: anger, confusion, and the overwhelming weight of betrayal. The land wasn't just a piece of property to me. It was a legacy, a part of my uncle that had been passed down through generations. I remembered the stories my uncle used to tell me as a child. How this land had been in the family for over 100 years. How it was more than dirt and grass, it was the foundation of everything my family had worked for. And now, it was slipping through my fingers, like sand. "Do you think he ever knew?" I muttered, more to myself than to Tom. Did my uncle ever know this would happen? That his legacy would be stolen like this? Tom didn't answer right away, and I didn't need him to. I already knew the truth. It didn't matter what my uncle had known. What mattered now was that I wasn't going to let this go. This land was mine, and no matter what it took, I was going to get it back. The phone calls started coming in the middle of the night. At first, it was just a few missed calls from a number I didn't recognize. But then the messages started: "You're making this harder than it needs to be, sign the papers and move on," and finally, a voice message that sounded like Mr. Collins himself, laced with thinly veiled threats. "You're being difficult, Mike. We've made a very generous offer. All you have to do is sign over the land and walk away." "Don't make this worse for yourself," he said, the smoothness in his voice making me want to throw my phone across the room. I didn't answer. Instead, I stared at the screen for what felt like hours. My hands were shaking, and my pulse was racing. I could feel my stomach turning. They weren't just trying to buy me out, they were trying to bully me into submission. I knew I couldn't back down. But their tactics were wearing me down. Every call, every message made me feel smaller, weaker. I wasn't some seasoned businessman, I wasn't built for this kind of fight. And the longer this dragged on, the more I felt like I was drowning in it. I met with Tom the next day. He was sitting in his office, a stack of legal files spread across his desk. He didn't look surprised when I walked in. "Mike," he said, his tone grave. "This is bigger than we thought." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" "The developers have connections here." "Big ones," Tom said, pushing a file towards me. "The HOA president, Mrs. Winters, is involved. She's been in on this from the start." My heart sank. I had suspected something like this, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. The town I had moved to, the community I thought was safe, it was all part of some bigger scheme. The developers weren't just a couple of businessmen trying to get a piece of land, they were connected to the very people who were supposed to protect the community. "Collins has the local officials in his back pocket," Tom continued. "They'll stall any legal action we try to take. And with Mrs. Winters behind them, we're going to face a lot of resistance." I leaned back in my chair, trying to absorb the weight of what he was saying. "So, what do we do now?" Tom's face was tight. "We fight. But it's going to be hard, Mike. We're up against powerful people. It's David versus Goliath, and right now, Goliath has the advantage." I felt my chest tighten. Fear, anger, confusion. They all tangled together, suffocating me. I was just one man, fighting for a piece of land. But it wasn't just land, it was my family's history, my uncle's legacy. This was everything I had. And I couldn't just give up. "Goliath won't win," I said, my voice surprisingly steady. "I'm not going to back down. This is my family's land, and I'll fight for it, no matter who they know or what they can do." Tom nodded, but I could see the concern in his eyes. "I just want you to know what we're up against." "I know," I said, the words coming out in a whisper. "But I can't lose this. I won't." And in that moment, I knew something had shifted inside me. The fear was still there, but so was something stronger, rage. Rage at the people who thought they could take what wasn't theirs. Rage at the system that allowed this to happen. And most of all, rage at myself for not seeing it sooner. They had no idea what they were up against. The weight of the situation was heavy on me, but as I walked around the town, speaking to the neighbors, I started to feel like I wasn't alone in this fight. One by one, I met people who had been pushed out, silenced, or intimidated by the same developers and corrupt officials that were after my family's land. "You're not the only one, Mike," George, a man who lived a few houses down, told me one evening. His voice was quiet, almost as if speaking too loudly would invite trouble. "They took my property last year. They said it was for development. But it was just a way for them to get rid of people like me. Folks who've lived here for decades, watching everything we've built slowly disappear." His words stuck with me. As I continued talking to others, local families, retirees, people who had put their whole lives into their homes and businesses, I realized something: they had all been wronged by these developers. They had all suffered under the weight of these people's greed, and not a single one of them had the power to fight back alone. But together, we could. I met with Tom later that week. I told him about the residents I'd spoken with. They've all been through it, I said, trying to keep the anger out of my voice. They're scared, but they're with me. They want to do something about it. Tom looked thoughtful. If we can get their testimonies, publicly, in court, we can make a real case. But we need more than just their words. We need proof. Solid, undeniable proof that these developers and the officials who are behind them are committing fraud. The thought of going up against powerful people, people who had the law on their side, was terrifying. But with every person I spoke to, with every story I heard, I felt a little less scared and a little more determined. They weren't going to take this away from me. Or from any of us. The next day, I gathered a small group of neighbors who agreed to testify. They shared their stories, told me about the shady deals they'd witnessed, the lies they'd been told. It was all coming together, and slowly, the weight of the fight didn't feel so heavy anymore. "We'll stand with you, Mike," George said, his voice steady now, full of conviction. "This isn't just about your land anymore. It's about all of us." I nodded, feeling something shift inside me. This wasn't just my battle. This was about standing up for what was right. I took a step back, letting it all sink in. I wasn't alone. And no matter how hard this got, no matter what obstacles we faced, I wasn't giving up. Not now. Not ever. I didn't sleep much that night. Instead, I went through every town record I could get my hands on. I was desperate. I needed something solid, something irrefutable that would prove these developers and the corrupt officials had been working together to steal my family's land. Hours passed. The pile of paperwork on my desk grew higher. Old deeds, property surveys, tax records, nothing seemed to make sense. My head ached, my eyes burned, but I couldn't stop. I couldn't afford to stop. My uncle's legacy was on the line, and I wasn't about to let it slip away because of a few crooked businessmen. Then, there it was, 2 letters, buried at the bottom of a box labeled Miscellaneous Correspondence. The letters were dated years ago, but they were from the developers to the town's planning commission. They were dated before my uncle passed, and reading through them made my blood run cold. In them, the developers openly discussed their plans to acquire my family's land. They had a clear strategy, manipulating the legal system, using loopholes, and bribed officials to force people out. They had known all along they would take the land. It wasn't a mistake. It was a well-orchestrated plan. I sat back in my chair, the weight of the discovery hitting me. These letters were the smoking gun. This wasn't just about a dispute over property. This was conspiracy. This was fraud. I had the proof, the evidence that tied everything together. I couldn't believe it, these developers had manipulated the entire town, and I had the proof to stop them. I immediately called Tom. "You won't believe what I found," I said, my voice shaking with excitement. "What is it?" he asked, already sounding concerned. "I have the evidence," I replied. "Letters. From the developers. They planned this whole thing. They knew what they were doing. They've been working with the officials to steal the land." There was a long pause on the other end of the line before Tom spoke again, his voice low. "This changes everything. We need to act fast." I knew he was right. But we needed more than just a legal battle. We needed the public to know. They needed to see the truth. I reached out to Sarah, a reporter I had met a few weeks earlier. I'd heard she had a reputation for exposing corruption, and if anyone could get the story out, it was her. "We've got to go public with this," I told her when she answered. "I have the proof. The developers, the officials, they're all in on it." She didn't hesitate. "Send me everything you have. I'll get this out there." Within hours, the story was running in the local paper. It wasn't just a small article. It was front-page news. The corruption I had uncovered was laid bare for the whole town to see. As the story spread, more outlets picked it up. Soon, people started calling me, neighbors, friends, even strangers, thanking me for standing up, for fighting back. The developers were no longer the faceless giants they had been before. They were under scrutiny. They couldn't hide behind their power anymore. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to relax. I leaned back in my chair, a deep breath escaping my chest. People were finally believing me. They were finally seeing the truth. I had taken back control. But I knew this wasn't the end. It wasn't over yet. The hardest part was still ahead. But at least now, I knew I wasn't alone. And I wasn't backing down. The courtroom felt suffocating as I sat there, watching the developers' lawyers pounce on every word, trying to twist the facts and paint me as a liar. Their arrogance was maddening. The weight of their words, their confident dismissals of the evidence we had gathered, made it hard to keep my composure. One of the developers' lawyers, a slick man named William Green, stood up, his voice booming across the courtroom. "Your Honor, this case is nothing more than an emotional plea from the plaintiff. He's trying to exploit the death of his relative to avoid responsibility. There's no legal ground for these claims. These letters, these documents he's presented, they are fabricated. His allegations are baseless." I clenched my jaw, my hands tightening on the table in front of me. Green's words stung, and I could feel my resolve beginning to waver. Could they be right? Was everything I had fought for, everything I believed in, just a lie? But then I remembered why I was here. I wasn't just fighting for my land. I was fighting for my family's dignity, for the legacy my uncle left behind. This was bigger than me. This was about standing up against corruption that had been allowed to thrive for too long. I looked around the courtroom, and that's when I saw the faces of my neighbors. Faces I had come to know so well over the past few months. There was George, sitting with his wife, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, his eyes full of determination. There was Sarah, the reporter, who had worked tirelessly to get the truth out. And then there was Tom, who had stood by me every step of the way. They believed in me. And I wasn't about to let them down. The judge, a woman with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense attitude, looked at me, waiting for my response. I could feel the pressure mounting, the weight of the room pressing down on me. But something inside me shifted. I couldn't let the developers win. Not after everything that had happened. I stood up, my legs a little shaky, but I forced myself to stand tall. "Your Honor," I began, my voice steady, despite the storm raging inside me. "What I'm presenting to you is the truth. These documents are not fabrications. They are evidence of a long-standing conspiracy to steal my family's land. I didn't come here to make up stories. I came here because I have proof." The courtroom was silent. I could feel everyone's eyes on me. For the first time in weeks, I felt a surge of confidence. My words were coming out clearer, stronger than they had been in my mind. I spoke about the letters, about the fraudulent signatures, about the corrupt officials who had enabled this entire operation. "I'm not asking for your sympathy. I'm asking for justice," I said, my voice gaining strength. "This land isn't just a piece of property. It's my family's legacy. And I won't let anyone take that away." As I spoke, I noticed the shift. Green's confident demeanor faltered, and I saw a flicker of doubt cross the judge's face. This wasn't just about a piece of land anymore. This was about doing what was right. And for the first time in a long time, I felt certain that justice would prevail. I had finally found my voice. And I wasn't going to back down. The room was deathly quiet as the judge read her decision. I could feel my heart hammering in my chest, the words hanging in the air like a heavy weight. My eyes were fixed on her as she spoke. "After reviewing the evidence presented, it is clear that the documents in question are fraudulent," the judge said, her voice firm. "The land in dispute is hereby returned to the plaintiff, Mike Ramirez. The developers and the officials involved are to pay fines, and criminal charges will be filed against those responsible for the fraudulent activities. I barely heard the rest of her words. My mind was racing, trying to process what had just happened. The land, my family's land, was finally ours again. The fight I had fought, the sleepless nights, the stress, the constant feeling of being at the edge of defeat, it all led to this moment. I had won. The gavel came down with a sharp crack, signaling the end of the hearing. It was over. I exhaled, a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, and let my shoulders relax. I could feel the tears welling up, but I held them back. This wasn't the time for weakness. Not now. I turned to see Tom, Sarah, and my neighbors standing behind me. They were all staring at me, a mixture of disbelief and joy on their faces. And before I knew it, I was pulled into a hug by George, who was grinning ear to ear. "You did it, Mike," he exclaimed, clapping me on the back. "We all did it." I smiled, my throat tight. I wanted to say something, but the words caught in my chest. I hadn't done this alone. Not by a long shot. This victory wasn't just mine. It was a victory for all of us who had fought together to expose the truth, to stand up against the corruption that had plagued our town for far too long. My family's legacy was intact. The land was mine again, and now, with the developers and officials being held accountable, I could finally breathe. But it wasn't just about winning the case. It was about what it meant for everyone who had been affected by this greed, this exploitation. We had taken a stand, and together, we had made a difference. Later that evening, I sat alone in my living room, reflecting on everything that had happened. The courtroom battle felt like a distant memory now. What stood out more than anything was how much I had changed. This fight had pushed me to my limits, but it had also taught me the value of persistence, the importance of standing up for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. I thought about my uncle, about how he had always taught me the importance of family, of legacy. I realized that it wasn't just about protecting a piece of land. It was about preserving the values that had been passed down through generations. It was about fighting for the future, for the people who would come after me. I had learned that true strength isn't about winning every battle. It's about having the courage to keep fighting, even when you're scared. And more than anything, I had learned that the power of community was unstoppable. I looked out the window, watching the sun set over the land that now belonged to us once again. And for the first time in a long while, I felt at peace. The land that had been torn apart by developers now slowly began to heal. The once barren fields were starting to show signs of life again, the grass growing tall and strong, the trees standing proud where they had been uprooted. I'd spent the last few months working tirelessly to restore it, repairing fences, replanting trees, and bringing back the sense of peace my uncle had always cherished. It wasn't easy. It was grueling, sometimes frustrating, and often exhausting. But every day, I could see the progress, and it reminded me of why I was doing this. My uncle's spirit was in this land. I could feel it. His lessons about the importance of family, of legacy, had guided me through the darkest parts of this fight. I often found myself smiling when I thought about him, wishing he could see what I was doing. He had always believed in the power of the land. Now, I was giving it back to him, in a way. One evening, as I stood overlooking the fields, I couldn't help but feel proud. I wasn't just restoring a piece of property. I was honoring my family's history, and it felt like the right thing to do. The land was thriving again, and in a way, so was I. I had fought hard, and I had won. And now, the future was beginning to look bright again. As I worked to restore the land, the town began to change too. The developers, once so powerful, were no longer in control. With the criminal charges filed and the public exposure of their actions, they had lost their grip. The corrupt officials who had turned a blind eye to the developers' plans were voted out in the next town elections, and new leaders. People who cared about the community, took their place. It was like a weight had been lifted from the town. People who had once been too afraid to speak up started coming forward. Neighbors who had been silenced by fear began to voice their support, sharing their own stories of how they had been wronged. It felt good to see the town come together. This wasn't just about my family anymore. This was about restoring what had been broken, about rebuilding trust and faith in the community. I often walked through the streets, talking to people, listening to their concerns. I wasn't just the man who had fought for his land anymore. I had become part of something bigger, something more important than just a piece of property. The fight had changed me. I had learned the value of persistence, of standing up for what's right, even when it seems impossible. And I had learned the power of community. One afternoon, as I stood on the land, looking at everything I had fought to preserve, I realized that the legacy wasn't just in the land itself. It was in the people, in the unity that had been restored. The victory wasn't just mine, it was all of ours. This journey had transformed me. I had become a different person, a stronger, more determined version of myself. And as I looked out at the land, fully restored, I knew my uncle would have been proud. My family's legacy was secure, and the town had been given a second chance. It was more than just a victory, it was the beginning of something new. As I stood there, looking out over the land, I couldn't help but feel a sense of peace wash over me. The grass swayed gently in the breeze, the trees that had once been torn down were now standing tall again. Everything felt right. My uncle's land, the legacy that had been at risk, was finally restored, and with it, something deeper, something I hadn't fully understood until now, had been restored within me. I thought about the journey, the fights, the sleepless nights, the fear and the uncertainty. But I also thought about the people I had met along the way, the neighbors who had supported me, the town that had stood up to the corruption, and the strength I never knew I had. This victory wasn't just mine. It was for every person who had been wronged, who had been silenced, who had been taken advantage of by those in power. It was for everyone who had ever been afraid to speak out. I didn't just win back land, I won back something much more important. I won back the belief that what's right will always prevail, even when the odds are stacked against you. The developers had thought they could intimidate me, that they could take what wasn't theirs. But in the end, they were the ones who lost, not just because of the legal battle, but because they underestimated the power of standing up for what's right. I thought about the people I'd met along the way. George, who had been there from the beginning, who had encouraged me when I felt like giving up. Sarah, the reporter who had helped expose the truth. And Tom, my lawyer, who had believed in this case when no one else did. We had all fought for something bigger than just property, we fought for integrity, for the future of our town. I felt stronger now. More resilient. The battle had changed me in ways I hadn't expected. I was no longer just the man who had inherited land, I was someone who had fought for it, and in doing so, had found strength I didn't know I had. I had learned that standing up for what's right, no matter the cost, is worth everything. The land wasn't just restored. Neither was I. This wasn't just about reclaiming property. It was about reclaiming the strength to fight for what's right. It was about showing myself that even when things seem impossible, justice can still prevail. And that, to me, was the most important victory of all.